Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to shortly, briefly comment on our offerings. It's basically two offerings. One is on the ETF side, i.e. single factor investing, and the other one is systematic equity, as we call it. One thing I would like to build on what Paolo referred to before is factor investing, in fact, is nothing new. It's rather old. And we have implemented it 10 years ago under the heading of systematic equity. I go into that in my second part. I would like to begin with one of the most important questions when it comes to factor investing, and Paolo has alluded to that before already as well, namely, how likely is it that factor excess returns are going to stay also in the future? I think that's a very important question to come up and start with. First of all, you have on the left-hand side some of the most, let's say, often cited factors and how they performed over the past. That looks nicely, and hence the question, what about the future? Typically, it depends, as we usually say in economics. There are three camps I would like to mention: systematic risk, behavior, or constraints. So if factor excess returns are related to systematic risk, you might assume that there might be a risk premium also going forward if there is systematic risk. So that's kind of rooted in the standard efficient market hypothesis model of economics. Then the behavioral approach that typically would hold true also going forward in case if the behavioral, let's say, the behaviors of investors continue to be the case, be it home bias or whatever, buying winners and shorting losers and so forth. These types of behavioral approaches. And then there are constraints. This is also kind of rational explanations of factor excess returns in the sense of that there are constraints to investors that make it possible that there are factor excess returns, be it, for example, constraints to borrowing, or be it constraints in terms of time horizon. So at the end, every investor has to make up his mind in which kind of story he believes and what he believes, and hence whether he or she invests into that or not. As I mentioned, we have single factor portfolios. We have launched these ETFs last year. So if you want to kind of easily invest into any or several of these factors, here they are. Maybe you find others. That's what we believe, at least on the ETF side, how one could do it. Be it in one of these factors or several, as we discussed before, because of the benefits of kind of a portfolio of factors. And this is essentially at the heart of our let's say, systematic equity approach, namely the observation here as well that factor excess returns are relatively low correlated, maybe even negative, depending on. And how to exploit that? Well, of course, by going for a portfolio approach. What we do here is typically the following. We have 4 steps in our investment approach. We start with sector-based multi-factor selection models. As a second step, we then do 5 long-short portfolios. So there is no relation to the market, and these long-short portfolios are defined in a way that they do not have any, that these 5 long-short portfolios each have an exposure to its own factor of 1 and 0 to all others. So this is exactly what we talked, or what Paolo mentioned before, namely that we come up with portfolios where the factors are independent of each other. So I think that's a key consideration that we have implemented in our investment process. Next, the third step is then to combine these 5 long-short portfolios into one. And from that long-short portfolio, we take implied returns And these implied returns, alongside with risk, we then apply to client benchmarks, taking also client restrictions, constraints into account, as well as transaction costs. So, in fact, what we do, we start with long-short portfolios. We could end there and just implement long-short portfolios, but typically, at least currently, the main demand comes from 7 different strategies with respective long-only benchmarks behind it, and we apply this process and the long-short portfolio to these 7 benchmarks. Then the question obviously is, how does that look like in terms of experience, particularly in terms of value added? As you can see, over the long run, 5 years, and then to the very right-hand side, since inception, all our 7 strategies did outperform. On average, we have added some 100 basis points with tracking error on the order of 1.5. So an information ratio of 0.7, which is really a good result, I would say. One of the biggest challenges, at least investment performance-wise, was Q4 last year with regard to the global systematic portfolio. That's the top one, which has, let's say, significantly less holdings than the global systematic equity and the global systematic enhanced, and therefore we had, let's say, therefore we have a lower transfer coefficient from the long-short portfolio, and that's what affected the Q4 performance. We had a drawdown on the order of 2%. It's recovering Q1 this year, but 1 year still negative. Maybe a final one on specifics for Swiss investors that we would kind of recommend to bear in mind. First of all, it's currency risk that we typically would suggest to systematically hedge away, because this is not rewarded, as we believe. Then the universe, typically we would suggest to go for a broad universe where you can typically benefit more of any mispricings. And thirdly, the wrapper, always something to consider. We would suggest to go for Swiss or maybe Irish domiciled funds, if not mandates, obviously. The LOCs have a little bit the problem, at least the funds, in the sense that there is no double tax treaty with the US. Well, that's it from my side. John?